One of the most interesting figures in the crime genre is the victim, especially the hero victim. And ultimately, there really isn't a victim as such, because the victim becomes a kind of destroyer. A victim is someone who has been changed against their will, and they need to restore balance. And in order to restore balance, they have to make further change in the world. Now, if you read all of Aristotle's The Poetics, which I hope you did as your homework, you're going to find that a story usually needs some sort of reversal of fortune. That helps things be dynamic, and it helps the story feel complete at the end. And the character undergoes substantial change. And if, viewers don't get this in a movie, they just get a static character and nothing happens and it's kind of boring. If we look at the case of the gangster movie, what we often see is someone rising from poverty to a state of grace, and then they fall flat on their face and they're a victim of their own overreaching. But in other aspects of the crime genre, what we want to see is this victim who has been changed against their will, moving from a state of suffering to a state of action, and then to resolution. This isn't what happens in art house movies, for example. So if you want a quick example, you could think of the role of the victim in an independent or small cinema movie like Lars von Trier's Breaking the Waves, for example. And in that, you see a person making herself into a victim in order to alleviate the suffering of someone else who is trying to handle their own suffering, and then she creates suffering that's even double and worse. And it's just a really sort of weird thing. The central character of that film moves from a state of suffering into action, but ultimately is just increasing her own personal suffering every time she acts to change her conditions. But in a popular film, victims are someone like Paul Kersey in Death Wish that I hope you've seen, or like Batman, or like the central character of Darkman, or Spider-Man, or The Crow, or many other characters who come from the world of Hollywood movies. These people begin as victims and they go on to project their suffering onto criminals in ways that are very interesting to look at. So in a Hollywood crime film, the victim moves from a passive role to an active role, but not to endure their suffering, but to attempt to literally and symbolically eliminate it. Their ultimate goal is to place that pain out onto the world, specifically onto the criminals who hurt the hero in the first place. And so a lot of what's going on is empowering the victim. And one of the cliches that we see in crime films is a victim making a move from being passive victim to avenger when the hero engages in an act of revenge, and the first act of revenge. So often what you'll see is that this hero gets physically ill. In Death Wish, for example, the first time that Paul Kersey kills, he falls down in emotional anguish. Another character might vomit after killing someone. But strangely, and this is a cliche that you want to look at, is that it usually takes a very small amount of time between this initial reaction of being physically ill from an act of revenge that they've taken to their enjoyment of being an avenger, of being an active person who balances the scales. And the brevity, of course, comes from the short nature of the movie narrative format, and so much of movie success comes from how convincingly one can portray that transformation from victim to destroyer. But as we watch these scenes, notice how you experience visual and auditory excitement of that move from being a passive victim to an active person. Look at the tools that the movie is using in order to make that convincing to you. And if it is a cliche, notice what it is that draws that cliche out to you so that you feel like, this is hackneyed and not enjoyable at all. Because ultimately what you're looking at are behaviors that normally would be unacceptable in the world. And somehow it becomes successful or acceptable to us by the way that the tools of cinema are showing it to us on the screen. And a lot of that has to do with that as a character is empowered on the screen, we too are empowered. So why is empowerment so attractive to us as an audience? Well, on one level, it's because we as a society tend to hold anti-authoritarian tendencies. So America, for example, is found on a kind of anti-authoritarianism. And it doesn't matter if we're talking about Mark Twain's Huckleberry Finn or George Lucas's Han Solo. Americans like people who go against authority. Arnold Schwarzenegger, Bruce Willis, these were favorites in their day because, like Frank Sinatra before them, they did it their way, and this is very popular. If these characters were passive or they were following the rules of society, we wouldn't find the movies about them interesting or satisfying. So even if there are these cliches, they're just very, very much tapping into our anti-authoritarian tendencies. It's going against the grain that makes things so exciting. But it raises the question, are these characters really going against the grain, or are the actions that they are engaging in promoting us to be obedient to the status quo? So one famous example that's discussed a lot is Lethal Weapon. If you look at the Lethal Weapon series, you have this out-of-control detective who has this ultra-conservative scaredy-cat partner, but no matter what happens throughout the whole story, no matter how we get involved in the anti-authoritarian tendencies of the crazy partner in the detective story, we see them both going home, and symbolically in the background they're collecting their paychecks and they are paying their taxes. And this image at the end of the movie of going home to the house with the white picket fence perhaps, arguably, unconsciously trains us to also go home at the end of the day. So we get to have our anti-authoritarian fantasy of being against the rules of proper conduct and order, only to have a final message where at the end of the day, yes, you got to break all the rules in order to be a hero, but you still go home and you still pay your taxes, and this is a way of training us in society to also just accept the rules of society. And this is an interesting argument. It's part of that movies as hypnosis argument. And it's really interesting in the context of victimhood, because we really don't have these people as being victims. If they are victimized, they go to a state of action that releases them from that victimization, but then only to go home and still obey the larger rules of society. Now, why else might the plight of victims in crime films be so interesting? Well, one reason is that we don't really see victims other than those who move from a passive state to an active state, because the crime movies removes all other victims. And they're unpleasing, they're uninteresting, and would really be depressing. So in Death Wish, the wife is killed and the daughter is removed from the film as much as possible. Now in Death Wish 2, the daughter is killed as quickly as possible, and arguably this is because we need the victim to be removed from our vision as quickly as possible, because they're not interesting to worry about. Audiences of crime genre want to focus on the investigation of crime or on acts of revenge, and we want to focus on the empowerment of the hero in order to take action and resolve the problems and the tensions in society. So victims and images of people being victims are not about empowerment. It's about weakness. And so victims are signs of defeat, and victimhood creates all kinds of themes about relying on others for sustenance and strength rather than relying on ourselves. So as I talk about in the book that I wrote called Horror Genre Secrets for Screenwriters, horror is a genre where victims become interesting for different reasons, and we'll see this, but in the horror genre, victims represent the breakdown of the body through the open wound, for example. Literally and symbolically speaking, this open wound, either on the body or internally through the psyche, shows us that humans are creatures that change. We decay, we're messy, we're unfixed. And we're confronted with that fact. We're confronted with the fact that we live in a body that's always in the process of dying. But in crime films, and this relates crime films to action films, we require this stable body, a body that's fixed, and a body that even when it's injured is still one that can move forwards in life. It can move towards life and away from death. And so this ability to move is the core reason why we are so interested in having our sympathy with the hero who takes action and removing the victims from our vision as soon as possible. So when you look at Death Wish and you go to the sequel, notice just how quickly the victims are removed and we're just focused on the acts of revenge. We're looking at movies that want us to explore the possibilities for action, the possibilities for being empowered, and have this vested interest in moving towards life and domination and control, but then again, in a way that ultimately encourages us as a society to obey the rules of society. So we have this interest and this need for life, and this is all coming together into scenes of exaltation. If you look at a lot of these movies, there's something that can be called the exaltation scene, where it is very clear to us that we have a moment of triumph. And in this, we have the erasure of any trace that the hero was ever a victim at all. So to stick with Death Wish, if you remember the end of that movie, we see Paul Kersey. He now is newly arrived in Chicago. We see a woman getting harassed, and this reminds us that crime is everywhere. Crime is happening all the time, that characteristic of crime genre that we have talked about. And Paul Kersey crouches down to help the woman, and he pretends to shoot the criminals with his fingers. And this not only tells us that a sequel is coming, but it's an exaltation scene. It's a scene of the hero's total triumph. And it's so important to notice that the film doesn't really go on anymore about revenge or anything about the rape problem in a substantial way. It's just focused on the end message that whatever crime Paul Kersey commits himself as a vigilante, nothing is as bad as the corrupt police system which let this happen to his family in the first place. So his vigilantism, at least in terms of the movie's logic, becomes more effective than the police procedure can ever be, and it becomes very, very important that he has gained this power, and we see this in this scene of exaltation. It's very, very interesting, and I'd love to hear your thoughts about it in our discussion group.